this episode, we shift into optimization, which is the mathematical engine behind many data and AI techniques. And we focus on a specific reality that beginners often overlook. Most real decisions come with constraints. A pure unconstrained optimization problem asks you to find the best solution according to some objective, like minimizing error or maximizing reward, without restrictions. In practice, restrictions are everywhere, such as limits on budget, time, risk, capacity, fairness, privacy, or system resources. In cloud security and cybersecurity settings, constraints are especially important because decisions often involve trade-offs between protection and usability, between detection and workload, and between data access and privacy. If you ignore constraints, you can build a solution that is theoretically optimal but impossible to deploy or unsafe to operate. The goal is to understand what constrained optimization is, how it differs from unconstrained optimization, and why practical solvers exist to find workable solutions when perfect answers are not realistic. By the end, you should be able to explain optimization as a structured way to choose among options under rules, rather than as an abstract math topic disconnected from real systems. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to ground optimization is to think of it as choosing a point in a space of possible decisions, where each point corresponds to a choice the system could make. The objective function is the score you want to improve, such as reducing cost, reducing error, or increasing detection of threats, and optimization is the process of finding the point that gives the best objective value. In unconstrained optimization, the only goal is to optimize the objective, so the best point is simply the minimum or maximum, depending on the problem. In constrained optimization, some points are not allowed, and those restrictions define a feasible region, meaning the set of choices you are permitted to consider. In cloud security, a feasible region might be defined by rules like do not block critical production traffic, do not exceed a certain false positive workload, or do not process certain sensitive fields outside a controlled environment. Beginners sometimes assume constraints are secondary, but constraints are often the primary definition of what success means, because a solution that violates constraints is not success at all. Once you think in terms of feasible regions, the difference between constrained and unconstrained methods becomes intuitive. Unconstrained methods search the whole space, while constrained methods search only the allowed part. Constraints come in different forms, and understanding those forms helps you see why solver behavior can vary. An equality constraint says something must be exactly true, like the sum of allocated resources must equal a fixed budget. An inequality constraint says something must be at most or at least a limit, like workload must not exceed capacity or risk must stay below a threshold. Constraints can also be hard or soft, meaning hard constraints must never be violated, while soft constraints express preferences that can be traded off when necessary. In security operations, hard constraints might include compliance rules or safety requirements, while soft constraints might include preferences like minimizing friction for users. Beginners sometimes treat all constraints as hard, which can make problems impossible, or treat all constraints as soft, which can lead to unsafe solutions. A professional approach is to classify constraints and ensure stakeholders agree on which are non-negotiable. This classification also influences how you model the problem, because some solvers handle hard constraints directly, while soft constraints are often represented by penalties added to the objective. When you learn to express constraints clearly, you can transform vague business rules into solvable mathematical structure. Unconstrained optimization methods are often taught first because they are simpler to explain, and they include approaches like gradient descent, where you move in the direction that reduces the objective most quickly. In machine learning, unconstrained optimization is common because many training objectives are written as unconstrained minimization of a loss function. Even then, there are often implicit constraints, such as regularization that discourages extreme parameter values, which can be seen as a soft constraint encoded as a penalty. Beginners can think of unconstrained optimization as moving freely downhill until you reach a low point, without needing to worry about boundaries. This mental model is useful for understanding training flow in neural networks, where gradients guide updates. However, in real decision problems, moving downhill freely is rarely permitted because choices must respect limits and policies. In cloud security, even if a model suggests blocking more traffic would reduce risk, you cannot simply block everything because availability and business operations are constraints. So unconstrained methods are often a starting point, but they are not the full story for operational decision-making. The key is to see unconstrained optimization as the baseline case where the only objective is performance. Constrained optimization introduces the idea that the best solution might sit on the boundary of what is allowed, because the unconstrained optimum may be outside the feasible region. Imagine your objective is to reduce incident risk by increasing monitoring coverage, but monitoring coverage increases cost and operational workload. If you had no constraints, you might monitor everything at maximum detail, but constraints on cost and storage may forbid it, so the best feasible solution might be the one that uses the full allowed budget without exceeding it. This boundary behavior is common in security because budgets and capacities are real and binding. Constrained methods therefore need mechanisms to handle boundaries, such as projecting steps back into the feasible region or using penalty terms that make constraint violations expensive. Beginners often think constraints are rare special cases, but in many practical problems, constraints define the problem's shape more than the objective does. For example, a detection system might aim to maximize true positives, but the real driver of design is how many alerts analysts can handle per day. That workload constraint becomes the effective boundary, and optimization happens inside it. Understanding boundary solutions helps you interpret why an optimized system may look like it is pushing limits intentionally, because it often is. Penalty methods are a common way to turn constrained problems into unconstrained ones by adding extra terms to the objective that penalize violating constraints. Conceptually, you keep the original objective, but you subtract points or add cost whenever a constraint is violated. So the optimizer naturally avoids violating constraints because it becomes too expensive. This is a soft constraint approach, and it is useful when constraints are preferences or when strict feasibility is hard to enforce during intermediate steps. In cloud security, penalty thinking appears in threshold tuning, where you might balance false positives and false negatives by assigning costs to each type of error. It also appears in resource allocation, where you might assign a cost to exceeding a latency budget or to consuming too much memory. The benefit of penalty methods is flexibility, because you can trade off objectives in a smooth way. The risk is that if you choose penalty weights poorly, the optimizer may violate constraints more than you intended or may become overly conservative. Beginners often struggle here because penalty weights feel arbitrary, but a mature approach ties weights to real business costs and risks. When penalty weights reflect reality, the optimization aligns with stakeholder priorities. Another way constrained optimization appears is through explicit feasibility methods, where the algorithm ensures every step stays within the allowed region. One simple concept is projection, where after taking a step that might leave the feasible region, you project back onto the nearest allowed point. This can be visualized as walking downhill, and, if you cross a fence, snapping back to the closest point inside the fenced area. This approach can be powerful when constraints are simple, like keeping variables within upper and lower bounds. More complex constraints, like combinations of limits across multiple variables, can require more advanced techniques, but the intuition remains that feasibility is maintained throughout. In security operations, feasibility thinking is important because some constraints must never be violated, such as not sending restricted data outside a compliance boundary. If a decision system occasionally violates such a constraint, it can create legal or reputational harm. Feasibility methods align well with hard constraints because they enforce them structurally rather than through penalties. Beginners benefit from seeing that different constraints require different handling strategies, and some problems are easier to express with hard feasibility rules than with soft penalties. This is how you choose a modeling approach that matches the seriousness of the constraint. Practical solvers exist because many constrained optimization problems are too complex to solve perfectly in a reasonable time, especially when choices are discrete. Discrete decisions are choices like select these alerts to review, choose these resources to protect first, or allocate these limited response hours across incidents. And these decisions often involve integers, yes or no choices, and combinatorial explosion. When you have discrete choices, the number of possible solutions can grow so quickly that searching all options is impossible. In those cases, solvers use clever strategies to search efficiently, approximate good solutions, or guarantee optimality under certain conditions. The most important beginner insight is that solver choice is a practical engineering decision because you rarely need the mathematically perfect answer if it takes too long to find. In cloud security, you might need a good allocation decision in minutes, not a perfect decision in days, because threats move quickly and operational capacity is limited. Practical solvers help you find solutions that respect constraints and deliver high value within time limits. Understanding this trade-off prevents you from overpromising what optimization can do. There is also a difference between convex and non-convex optimization that influences solver behavior, and while the math can get deep, the intuition is worth having. In convex problems, the objective and constraints have shapes that guarantee any local optimum is also the global optimum, which makes solving more reliable. In non-convex problems, the landscape can have many local optima, making it harder to be sure you've found the best possible solution. Many machine learning training problems, such as training deep neural networks, are non-convex, which is why training can depend on initialization and learning rate schedules. In constrained decision problems, the presence of discrete choices often makes problems non-convex as well. Beginners sometimes assume optimization always finds the best answer, but solver outcomes can depend on problem structure and solver strategy. In security settings, this matters because you might accept a solution that is good enough and feasible, even if it is not provably optimal, as long as it is stable and explainable. A professional approach is transparent about what kind of solution the solver provides and what guarantees it does or does not have. This keeps stakeholder expectations aligned with reality. Constraints also shape evaluation and communication, because a constrained solution is best only within the constraints, and that qualifier must be stated clearly. If someone asks why you did not choose a solution that appears to have higher performance, the answer may be that it violated a constraint, such as exceeding alert review capacity or requiring access to restricted data. This is especially common in cloud security because operational limits are real and decision systems must be accountable. Beginners sometimes feel defensive when constraints limit performance, but constraints are not excuses. They are part of the design, and the right response is to show how the chosen solution respects the agreed boundaries. This also suggests a valuable habit. Record constraints explicitly and version them, because constraints can change over time as budgets change, teams grow, or policies evolve. If constraints change, the optimization problem changes, and the best solution can change, which means you need a structured way to revisit decisions. In operational systems, this can become a continuous optimization cycle, where you periodically re-optimize under current constraints. When you treat constraints as part of the product, not as hidden assumptions, your decision-making becomes clearer and more defensible. In cloud security work, constrained optimization often shows up in resource allocation and prioritization, even if people do not call it optimization. For instance, deciding which alerts get human review given a fixed analyst capacity is a constrained problem, and choosing a threshold that produces a manageable alert queue is a constrained problem as well. Deciding how to schedule vulnerability scans without overloading systems is another constrained problem, balancing coverage and performance impact. Even training models can be constrained, such as limiting model complexity to meet inference latency requirements or limiting data usage to meet privacy constraints. Seeing these everyday decisions as optimization problems helps you structure them, because you can define objective functions and constraints explicitly rather than relying on intuition alone. Beginners sometimes think optimization is only for advanced math problems, but it is really a way of thinking that makes trade-offs explicit. This is particularly valuable in security, where trade-offs are often high stakes and where stakeholders may disagree. Optimization provides a common language for describing why a particular decision is the best feasible one. Bringing everything together, optimizing under constraints means recognizing that most real problems are defined as much by what you cannot do as by what you want to do. Unconstrained optimization is a useful baseline and underlies many training algorithms, but operational decisions require constrained thinking because budgets, capacity, safety, and compliance define the feasible region. Constraints can be hard or soft, equalities or inequalities, and the way you represent them affects which solution methods make sense. Penalty approaches convert constraints into costs, while feasibility approaches enforce boundaries directly, and practical solvers exist because many real problems are too complex to solve perfectly within operational time limits. In cloud security and cybersecurity settings, constrained optimization is not abstract. It is the daily reality of prioritizing work, tuning thresholds, allocating limited response effort, and balancing risk reduction against business operations. When you can explain constrained versus unconstrained methods and why solvers focus on feasible, timely answers, you demonstrate a mature understanding of how AI systems become usable decision tools. That mindset is what makes optimization a practical skill rather than a theoretical topic.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.